Hello, Drew, and everybody who's saying hi in the question and answer. Thank you for coming out. This has been a lot of fun. I'm a little bit sad because today and tomorrow are the last two sessions of this series, but I've really enjoyed this series a lot. We started out with some foundational stuff that has to do with networking and career management and stuff like that. And today and tomorrow, I get to talk about stuff that I don't normally get to talk about. It's a bit of a weird topic today, onboarding yourself. And the reason why it's weird is because I'm usually not called in to talk about onboarding yourself. Most people want to talk about, like, how do I do LinkedIn, or how do I do networking, or how do I do career stuff or branding or whatever. And onboarding is something that we'll talk about later, right? And so, but here's the reason why I want to talk about this. First of all, I think it's a really important, critical topic to talk about. I think that a lot of times when we start a new role, we put a lot of our power and our faith into the boss or the system of the new company. And I think that's not good. I remember one of my first really big roles that I had, it was a good salary, it was a big title, it was a big deal. And I went there and they didn't have a computer for me for a couple of days. And they didn't have my office ready for a week or two. And you can imagine, I mean, everybody's so busy in the office. So it's kind of like, all right, go in that room and just find an empty desk and then just kind of figure out what to do for the next couple of days. And I thought, really? Like, this is what you got for me? And I'll tell you, the other jobs that I have had haven't been really far off from that. I mean, sometimes I go in and everything's ready and it's a delightful experience. But a lot of times there's just a lot of freedom for us to create what we're going to do and what our impressions are going to be and the impact that we're going to be able to have. And so what I want you to do is think about strategically what I can do to land really, really well in this organization. So I'm going to talk about a lot of those tactics. The other reason, though, that I really like this topic for job seekers is because as a job seeker, and if you're in the job search, you know kind of the drudgery that the job search is. And it's like, is this thing ever going to end? Am I ever going to get out of this job search? And honestly, when I talk about onboarding, like we're going to talk about it today, for me, this is a vision conversation. I want to plant in your mind that, yes, you will land a job. And yes, there's going to come a time where you're not going to be sitting at your computer doing job search stuff and being in some level of discouragement and despair. Like, it is going to get better and it's going to be awesome. And when it is better, here's what you do to make sure that it is as good as it can be. So anyways, that's what we're going to talk about today with onboarding yourself. A little bit of housekeeping. Once again, you can switch between my head and my slides. And so that's on your end. If my slides are not really intense, the first few are and the last few are, there's more words, but during the bulk of the presentation, it's probably better just to switch over to me. Also, there's a Q&A section. And so feel free to ask questions on the Q&A in the Zoom interface. I have that open right in front of me, and sometimes I will answer a question right away, and sometimes I'll let it sit, but I'll try and get to every single question. And finally, on your screen, you can see on the bottom left by my picture, I am at Jason Alba on Twitter. Feel free to follow me, and you can certainly share on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and wherever you are. You can share this series, the link to the Zoom sign up, or you can share my Twitter handle or whatever. I talk about career stuff. This is my passion, and it's been my passion for a long time. All right, so with that, let's jump over to what we're going to talk about. Once again, if you've been on these sessions, you'll know I've tried to keep it like really minimized on the agenda. And then one time I did like 8 different things. So today there's 4. We're going to talk about perspective, which is kind of talking about the foundational concepts that we'll use throughout the rest of this conversation, and that I want you to think about forever when you think about how and when to onboard yourself. We're going to talk about strategy and goals as it relates to onboarding. We're going to talk about networking and branding, and then I have a few career management thoughts. Like I said, if you've been on these sessions before, you've heard me talk about career management. And when I talk about career management, I usually sum it up as networking and branding, but I really wanted to break out networking and branding as its own thing. And then I have some new stuff to talk about with career management. All right, so probably tomorrow when I'm done with all this, I will have all the slides and links to blog posts, links to relevant courses, links to books and stuff like that you can reference. I noticed in the list of attendees that I have some career colleagues, people that I've met at network conferences and stuff like that. If you have any specific links or referral things, references that I can put on there to help with any of these topics, just shoot me an email and let me know, and I'll check it out. All right, so here are the relevant courses. So of course, the most relevant course for this topic is a course that I did. It's called Onboard Yourself, What to Do After You Land Your Dream Job. And once again, this is a visionary thing for job seekers. But even if you've had your job for a while, I want you to reset. I want you to think, okay, been here for a while, 3 months, 3 years, however long it's been, it's time to start over. And I wanna strategically move forward with where I'm at. And the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, these are things that you can do even if you've been in your job for 3 years. All right, here's a few other relevant Pluralsight courses. Working on a team. Hopefully you're thinking about strategic relationships and stuff like that. So hopefully you're thinking about how you can fit into a team, how you can move in without disrupting the team environment and kind of the flow that they have. I've actually seen people move into a team very aggressively, and it has not gone well at all. Either it ends poorly for the person who was aggressive and they end up not being on that team, or it takes a long time for those initial few months of aggressiveness to kind of wear off. Working and communicating with different personalities. This was a really fun course to work on. I talk a lot about the Myers-Briggs, and there's other personality assessments and ways to measure and all that stuff. And I don't get into talking about which is better. I just chose one because it's so popular in corporate America. And I wanted you to understand kind of what it means to have the results of different personality assessments. One of the things that is just really critical, and I found this in my own career, the more I learned about how I think and how I tend to behave, the more I've been able to understand how I'm going to act and react in certain situations, and the better I can prepare for some kind of high pressure situations. Also, the more I can understand why my colleague just did that really weird thing, why they said that thing, or why things are happening in team dynamics. When we start to appreciate other people, we talk a lot about diversity, and we want diverse thinking, and we want diverse ideas. When we start to appreciate the diversity of personalities and however you would call these assessment results, then we can really make some amazing progress. The synergy between allowing people to bring the best of them and the best of what they have to offer into a team environment is just awesome. So this is definitely a course that I think would help you as you go into this new environment and start thinking, okay, that person's a jerk. I don't like the way that person communicates. Let's move past some of those things and start to really understand the different personalities and how to work with and communicate. Kevin Murray has a course called Making Work from Home Work from You. And the reason why I wanted to bring this one up, and there's a few other work from home or working remotely courses, is because these are very strategic courses about setting up systems in your everyday workforce or your everyday work environment. And I need you to think about that. I need you to think about the systems that are going to help you be more effective in your production, right? In the HR world, we talk a lot about employee performance. Like, we want you to produce. We want you to perform. We want to see you hitting your metrics. We want you to be high performing, right? And a lot of that comes from having these systems, and that's what Kevin and some of the other authors who talk about working remotely talk about. I also want you to be able to have the right systems in place to communicate with other people. In my last role, where I was at an office job for a little bit, it's an open environment. If you've never worked in an open environment and then you get put into one, it can be super annoying. But anyways, so I was in this open environment, and I could see people all the way down to that end of the building and all the way down to that end of the building. And I could talk to whoever I wanted. I could shout over a couple of rows. But what I found is most people were communicating on Slack or Teams or email or chat or whatever it was. And even though we could go grab a conference room or whatever, the communication systems that we'll use, whether we're sitting right next to somebody and we want to communicate quietly, or we want to have something logged, or we're communicating from home and I'm at home and they're at home. We want to have these communication systems in place. And this is the stuff that you'll see in this making work from home work for you, or making work, and the other remote courses. All right, another one is Keeping Up with Technology by Dan Appelman. I like a lot of Dan Appelman's courses. We're going to talk about one of them more in depth tomorrow when we talk about finances. But this is another one that's really important, because we go through this process to land our job, and then we get there, and especially if you're in technology, you could be doing something right now, but in 6 months, you might be doing something completely different, or you'll be doing the similar stuff in a completely different way or with different technology. So this is one of the courses that I think is really important and relevant as we think about how to onboard ourselves. We need to strategically think ahead to, okay, when technology changes, as technology changes, how am I going to keep up with all of this stuff? All right, so the first thing we talked about was perspective. And once again, I could have called this foundations, but I wanted to do something different this time. One of the most important concepts in onboarding yourself, in my opinion, is that I want you to think as if you were the boss. Okay, so a lot of times we go into a role, and I know, on that first day or the first week, it's so mentally exhausting, right? There's all these people that we're going to meet, and we get a tour of the office, and it's just so overwhelming. There's a lot of information coming in. You're sitting in some meetings, and you're doing all the HR paperwork stuff and all that stuff. It's easy to sit back and say, okay, feed me, and I will do, hold my hand and carry me around the office. I'll do, and I'll meet, and all that, whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do that, right? But really, what I want you to think is, if I were the boss, how would I want this person to come into my team? And usually, the boss is not going to want you to sit back and wait for the boss to tell you what to do, right? So I think there could be a fine balance between going in really aggressively versus just sitting back completely. I don't want you to do either one. I think you need to be tactful and kind of figure out, without being too aggressive, like, here are the things that I'm going to accomplish. But if I were to hire somebody and I went to their desk after a couple hours and I'm like, hey, so how are things going? They're like, yeah, good. I've just been surfing around because I wasn't really quite sure what to do, right? I mean, obviously that's a problem of mine, and I didn't have my onboarding process set up well as the boss. But I'm not going to be really impressed with someone who's just sitting around and waiting. So I really want you to think about what, if you were the boss, how would you like someone to be onboarded, or how, what initiative you would like to see from them. And then just kind of figure out what would be appropriate for your boss. I've had some bosses that are like really, really hands-on, and they know exactly how they want you to act. And I've had other bosses who, like I said, with that other job, it's like, hey, just make yourself busy for the next few days or the next week while we get everything in place. And you're wondering, like, I'm really going to get paid for this whole week, even though you weren't really ready for me to come on. So think about that. Definitely and absolutely do all the HR onboarding stuff. Like, you got to check off all those check boxes. You got to do their stuff. You got to do their system. But that's not the onboarding that we're talking about. All right. The next concept on perspective is I want you to be proactive. I want you to, instead of being reactive and sitting back and waiting, I want you to think, okay, what are the things that I could and should be doing right now? And I know I've seen this so many times where people come in and they're like, well, I'm kind of worried about, should I do this or should I spend time here or whatever. So I want you to sit down and proactively think, okay, today, these are the things that I need to accomplish. And it could be go to the onboarding meeting and meet the team and get a tour of the building. It could be all of those things, but I want you to proactively list those things out and think about what you're going to do. And it's not just the first day. This is stuff that you'll do over time. We'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the phrases that I learned in my very first programming class back in college, it was a high energy professor. Gosh, I could tell you a lot of stories about him. It was a lot of fun. But one of the phrases that I learned from him, his name was David, was that he wanted employees, and bosses want employees to be, I never heard this phrase before, write this down, high speed and low drag. Took me a few times listening to that before I really understood what he was talking about. High speed and low drag. Basically, what he's saying is, I want you to perform well and quickly. Okay, I want you to do stuff, and I don't want there to be a lot of drag, or I don't want there to be a lot of friction. I don't want you to have to always come into my office and say, is this okay? Will you check my work? Or always have stuff going wrong and it's getting kicked back by QA. So what are the things that you can do? I'm not sure if high speed is the objective for that first week or the first few days, but definitely you want to be low drag, right? You want to have the right level of communication. You want to communicate the right things with your boss, but you don't want to be in his office his or her office 8 hours a day, right? You don't want to be in there asking, well, should I do this? And can I do this? And, figure out what you're going to do and then go do it, but don't be a high drag on him or her or your team or whatever. Okay. One of the things that comes up a lot, I've been reading about this over the last, year and a half or so since I left that last job. And I've been reading about this with a lot of interest because I went through it very deeply and I didn't understand it. I didn't know what I was going through. I didn't think I was going to go through it, but I've learned a lot about this thing that we call imposter syndrome. So I got this job. It was just really cool, like a perfect storm. All the stars, sun, moon, and stars were aligned. I got this dream job with my dream boss. I was really excited. I beat out a few other people, which always makes you feel good. And I remember sitting in his office probably the second or third week, and he's like, okay, this is where we're at. We've done these things, and here's where we're at now, and here's what I want you to do, and here's how I would do it if I were you. And I'm just sitting back taking notes, listening to this guy, and I'm thinking, why am I here? I mean, I had ideas, and I thought they were really good, and I sold myself well, but my boss really understands this better than I do. And he has a bigger vision and a different vision. And oh, by the way, he already listed out the 5 or 10 steps that I should take to make all this stuff happen. And I remember going out of that meeting thinking, I'm not the right guy for this. First of all, he should do it. Second of all, maybe they should have hired somebody else. And this is when I started to realize that imposter syndrome was creeping in. Now, here's the interesting thing. Even after knowing that I was going through imposter syndrome, it took a good 3 or 4 months before I got out of it. Now, I see online a lot of people are like, I have imposter syndrome. How do you deal with imposter syndrome? I'm a woman, and women have more imposter syndrome than men, which I don't know if there's data on that, but I know plenty of men who have imposter syndrome and struggle with imposter syndrome. Maybe it doesn't look like it. Maybe they don't talk about it, but they definitely have. There is a level of imposter syndrome for a lot of us as we start our new job. For me, there was a few things that I had to do. I had to kind of just come to terms with the fact that my boss had been in that role for a good 3 years. And he had been conceptualizing the new program that he brought me on to help him create for at least 2 years. He had worked through it in his mind. He had been selling it to the executive team. He had been doing competitive intelligence research in the market. Like, he had a 2-year head start on this whole thing. And I realized it was really unfair for me to walk into this environment and not feel like I was going to be at his level or behind or whatever. I needed to understand that it was okay for me to come in where I was at and move forward. And honestly, he was okay with that. One of the things I've done in the last few hires that I've made, the last few people that I brought on and worked on training, is I've made it very clear. I've said, look, you're probably going to have imposter syndrome. And it might take, get this, it might take 6 months for you to work through that. I just want to let you know that I'm going to be patient with you during those 6 months, but I don't want you to give up on yourself. Okay, now I realize that not all bosses are going to be like that. I realize there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be impatient, but I think a lot of times the biggest problem with imposter syndrome is with us, not with our boss and not with our team, okay? So what did I do? Lorena asked, how did you break out of it? I gave myself time to kind of settle through this thing. I knew it was in my head. I knew it was a head game. The thing that helped me was having little wins. When I was in meetings and I was able to contribute intelligently, when I was able to work on vision and strategy, but also on the operations side and create things and have these wins and work towards the objectives, that slowly started building my confidence. And that's how I was able to get out of the imposter syndrome. I think the key there is building your confidence, right? So you're in the interview process and you're like, I'm amazing, hire me. I'm the right person for the job. Here's all my qualifications, right? That's how we do the interview, right? And then we get into the role, and after a few days or a few hours, we're like, oh my gosh, am I the right person? I actually heard about somebody who had an amazing job. It was a great job. It was kind of cushy. It was high paying, very high paying. This person was completely qualified for the role, right? And he allowed his insecurities and his imposter syndrome to get the best of him, and he resigned. And I heard about that. I know this person, and he's kind of close to me. And I heard about that, and I just felt so sad because there's this expectation that we put on ourselves that we have to be performing and understanding at a certain level pretty quick. And the reality is that's not necessarily how our boss or what the expectations are of the organization. We were hired for a reason, and we need to understand that we were hired for a reason. One more thing on imposter syndrome, and then I'll move on. One of my favorite questions in a job search interview, and most of the time, I want to say every time, but for sure most of the time that I ask this question, the people in the panel or whoever I'm talking to are like, Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. So here's my question. And the reason why I'm sharing this is it's not just for the interview. Have this question with your boss after you land your job. Okay, sit down in a one-on-one and say, look, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really excited to be here on the team. I just want to revisit this topic and get your perspective now that I'm an insider, right? Because answers when you're in the interview versus answers when you've actually been hired could be different. So the question I have, and Phil says you're suffering for a little bit from this right now. The question I have is, what is success in this role? What does success look like in the next 3 to 6 months? And let your boss answer that question. So in the last role that I was in, I'm going to say it was a medium-sized company. I think I was hired number 350, rocket ship company, doing exceptionally well. But it still kind of had a small feel. It was just in the middle between small feel company and like lots of systems and starting to get a little bit bureaucratic. And so as I sat down and tried to understand what success was, we had our quarterly KPIs and stuff like that. The interesting thing was what I wanted to do was this long, detailed list of, here are a lot of things that I need to accomplish this quarter. And on my boss's wall were the KPIs for the next 4 quarters. And I couldn't believe how little he was expecting out of us. Now, I understand maybe when I say how little, there was only a few objectives, right? And so instead of my list of, here are a lot of different things that we need to be working on, he was thinking, if by the end of the quarter we accomplish these 3 things, we're going to have met our team goals, and this will have been considered a success. For me, I was like, man, I could do this stuff in like 2 weeks. Why are we spending 3 months on this? But I had to kind of pull back, slow down, and understand, first of all, it was okay just to do those KPIs, number 1. Number 2, let's go really deep on those KPIs. Let's make sure that we put the proper time into doing them really, really well with planning, strategy, testing, all of that stuff. So that's my conversation around imposter syndrome. So thank you for listening to that. Imposter syndrome baffles me because I actually have a bit of an ego. I don't know, you could probably tell that. I feel pretty confident about my capabilities. But when I was in the thick or the depths of imposter syndrome, I was like, wait, what's going on? This is not who I am. But I absolutely felt inadequate during that time. I had to have a lot of not long, but good, solid conversations with my boss just to really understand how we were going to work together. All right, another foundational perspective thing is learn the culture. It is really critical that when you get into your organization, you understand and learn the corporate culture. If you come in and you break the culture, if you break some of these unwritten rules that are happening in your team or in other teams or the whole company, you're going to be branding yourself in a way that could be very difficult to counter brand later. I remember I heard this analogy years and years ago about introducing a new cow into a herd. And you've probably heard this analogy too, but the idea is that you can come in like a bull and just kind of push everybody around and be very aggressive and all this stuff. Or you can just kind of like go off to the side a little bit and observe. And so I actually hired somebody, a programmer, a couple, 2 or 3 years ago. And this programmer came in and she questioned everything. She was like, I don't understand why we do this. I don't understand why we're using this language. I don't understand why we're using this task management system. I don't understand why we do this for testing. I don't understand. And she challenged everything. And the thing that my team, that drove us nuts was when she would say, well, in my last company, we did it this way. You know what? Honestly, I want to know how your last company did things. I really do. I want to understand and learn how. I want to learn the best practices and what other places are doing and what other effective dev shops are doing. But if all you're doing is criticizing what's in place on my team, in my shop, right? And you're saying, well, it's better if we do it this other way, then what happened, as you can imagine, is she quickly branded herself as being very, very difficult to work with. Nobody enjoyed working with her. And long story short, she didn't last very long. So I recommend, I'm not saying that you got to be meek and you got to be the wallflower and that you can't start contributing and adding value right away. But I would suggest, and I guess I'm talking mostly to people who have stronger personalities, like I'll sit in a meeting and I'm like a teapot where I'm just like getting really frazzled and I'm like, I really want to say something and I can't believe we're having this conversation, or how is this not obvious what the answer is? Why are we still talking about it? But one thing I've learned is, for your career health, it might be better for you to just kind of slow down and just observe and figure out what's going on and what the culture is, who the players are, right? Who are the people who have really good ideas? Who are the people that are making decisions? Who are the people who are kind of poking the buttons and stirring the pot and trying to get people riled up? And are they doing that for good reasons, to have better conversations and get to the truth? Or are they doing it because they like stirring the pot and getting people riled up? So as a foundational thing, I invite you to just slow down and be okay to just bite your tongue a little bit and figure out how things work. I got one of my earliest jobs, it was at the FBI in this little office. They didn't have many agents there. It was a lot of back office support. And I went in for the first few days, I think, wearing a shirt and tie. And I didn't have really bad threats, but I had a lot of people that would be like, hey, take your tie off. Hey, you're going to ruin this for the rest of us. They're going to change the dress code. And I did not realize that going in overdressed, I didn't think I was overdressed. I thought it was normal office dress, but I didn't realize that going in like that was going to disrupt their culture so much. It definitely didn't help me get off on the right foot with some people on the team. All right, another foundational thing that is just really important to understand: you got your job. Congratulations, it's awesome. You're going to get back on health insurance. You're going to get a salary. You're going to get whatever perks you got. But one of the things that I've learned over the years is nothing stays, right? Whether you leave on your own or your employer invites you to leave, there's going to be an end of that job. What I want you to do, it is a time to celebrate that you got your job, okay? It is a time to kind of relax a little bit, but I want you to make sure that you still take care of, as we say, numero uno. You got to take care of yourself. I learned early in my career that I thought that my boss would take care of me. I thought that my customers, my internal customers, would take care of me if I took care of them. I thought that HR would take care of me, but I learned that the only person that cares about my career for real is me. And so I want to make sure that even though you're going to celebrate and you're going to relax a little bit from the stress of an intense job search, and I don't want to scare you, but you still need to take care of you, and you still need to take care of your career. You can't let your company or HR or your boss or an executive that you've been buddy-buddy with, you can't depend on them to take care of you, because they might, every once in a while, they might fight some battles for you, but at the end of the day, everybody's kind of watching out for themselves. And I don't want to give the message that I don't want you to care about other people. I always want you to care about other people, but don't relax so much that you're not taking care of your own career management. Okay, so with that, let's jump over to the next section, which is strategies and goals. So in my onboarding course, I talk about a 30, a 60, and a 90-day plan. These are 3 separate plans. What am I going to do? What am I going to have accomplished? Where am I going to be in 30 days? Where am I going to be in 60 days? And where am I going to be in 90 days? So you can go check out that course and see how I kind of laid out those ideas and gave examples of what a 30 and a 60 and a 90-day plan is. For today, what I want to talk about is creating these goals or these objectives, first of all, in categories. So the first one is logistics. And this is really more in the 30-day. The 30-day logistics is, did I get all my paperwork in? Does HR have everything that I need? It's so weird to be in a professional position. You know, you're doing big stuff and you're making big decisions and you're having fun, right? And there's this really cool flow with your team. And then HR comes and they're like, hey, by the way, I still need to get that one piece of paperwork from you. So my advice is figure out what you need to get into HR to finish that whole HR onboarding stuff and get that done. So that's the logistics part. Normally, HR is really good about getting that all done and they're on top of that, but just make sure that you are working with them and take care of all that. Another category is whatever your proficiency or your skill set is. What you know, once you start learning what your job is and learning how your team operates and learning what the problems and the opportunities are and what the expectations are, you need to sit back and say, okay, what do I need to learn? Like what in this programming language or this system or in the industry jargon, what are the things that I need to understand to really be able to do my job better? Does that mean that I get to go out with a UX team and meet with customers and kind of get a real good understanding of who the customers are? Does it mean that I go take some course somewhere to learn about how this industry operates? Or if it's a new role for you or you're working with people from different roles than you've ever worked with, do you need to go learn how they do their job? Do you need to learn what their job is and how your role and their role interact, right? If it's technology, you know, you might have a real good understanding of where you're at, although the imposter syndrome will beat that up a little bit. Here's my recommendation. I mentioned this early on a couple of weeks ago. Go do the Pluralsight Skill IQs. This actually is my first invitation to you for this specific thing on your proficiency. Go do the skill IQ or multiple skill IQs to figure out where you're at on different technologies. This becomes your benchmark. Okay, so what you're going to get is a raw number and you're going to get a percentile. Like you could be in the 82 percentile of a certain technology or language or whatever. And then in 3 or 6 months, do it again. You can do it next month or whatever, however frequently. But what I want you to do is get a benchmark of where you're at with your skills. And this Pluralsight Skill IQ does it. It really is a brilliant tool that you can use. And by the way, it's free. You can go get your skill IQs for free. So anyways, go do that. Figure out what your proficiencies are. The other thing, and I mentioned this earlier a couple weeks ago, in the skill IQ, they give you your raw score, they give you your percentile and how you compare or rank against other, your colleagues and peers. And they give you a list of, here are the areas that you should brush up on. Here are the specific things that you should go learn about. I believe in continuing education. I didn't for a long time. I thought, I'm going to go to high school, I'm going to go to college, and then I'm going to be done with education. But I believe that we need to always be learning, whether you're reading books or you're learning new languages or you're going deeper on whatever. We need to continue our education. That's a big part of creating our own income security or hireability. All right, another category of goals could be what your exposure is in the organization. So within 30 days, I want to have met with everybody on my team at least once in a one-on-one. I want to have a meaningful conversation, whether that's at lunch, or it's in a conference room, or, you know, I just go to their desk and we have a 20 or 30-minute conversation. I want to have, I want to start to develop those professional relationships with people on my team. In the next 90 days, I want to meet, you know, 2 or 3 people from these different departments. And when I say meet, I'm talking about having significant conversations, not just shaking hands in the hallway or something like that. So when I talk about the category or of your exposure, I'm talking about 2 different things: your brand, which is how people perceive you. So what is it that you can do to create a brand that you want to have within the organization? How can you help people understand and perceive you in a certain way? Maybe what you do, I did this in my last organization, I started a conversation around, what was it, lean management? I don't remember what it was, but there was a book that I liked, and this was a couple years ago. So there was a book that I liked, and I invited people in our whole department to come on like Thursdays at 1, and we would have a 1-hour conversation about certain chapters of this book. Does that help your brand? Absolutely, right? Like, it's not necessarily that you're a do-gooder or like you're too involved in too many things, but it helps people understand that you're really interested in this particular topic, and that's going to shape their perspective of who you are, or it's going to help brand you. The other one is your network. And so your goal of exposure is maybe to meet a certain number of people or certain types of people within your organization, or customers, or partners, or prospects, or whatever, depending on what your role is. All right. Another thing that I want you to do in your goals is to identify, I said this earlier, identify who the players are. Who are the decision makers? You know, when you're in a meeting and there's this really hard, challenging thing that comes up, and somebody says, what do you think, John? And you realize that John is the person that makes a lot of the technical kind of architectural decisions. Or what do you think, Sally? And Sally's the one who has a really good understanding of marketing and all the stuff that goes around marketing. So one of the goals that you could have is to figure out, say within 60 days, who the players are. Who are the people who are influential, and in what areas, and what are their strengths? Because it might come down to, in a few months, you might be in a meeting and realize that you need to partner with one of those influential people so that your voice is amplified through the brand that they already have. I want you to also identify opportunities. What are opportunities in your team to make things better? What are opportunities with the product? What are opportunities with the processes or the systems? Once again, I don't want you to come in and be aggressive and like kind of say, well, here's how we should be doing it. And it makes everybody feel kind of stupid, or at least that you think that they're stupid because they're not doing it the right way or the best way, right? If you have ideas, figure out when and how you should approach them, or you should present them, but you should always be looking for those opportunities to make things better. At the same time, look for challenges. What are the problems that your boss has? What are the problems that your boss has that you might be able to help alleviate? What are the problems in the team dynamics, or what are the problems with whatever? These are things that you should identify, and I would write that out. Like, I want to identify 3 opportunities, or I want to identify 2 challenges that we have that I can help fix over the next 90 days, or at least come up with a solution to help resolve over the next 90 days. All right, so basically with our 30, 60, 90-day goals and the strategy of putting those together, create categories. I don't know what your goals are going to be. And like I said, you can go to my course on onboarding and you can see what the specific things that I gave as examples for 30 and 60 and 90 days. But really, you need to come up with your own ideas of what you want to accomplish in those first 30, 60, or 90 days. And then I want you to really work towards them. Like put them in writing and really work towards those. Those are your individual, your personal KPIs to have success in your role. just real quick, talking about goals, you've heard about SMART goals, and the SMART's an acronym. So that is specific. So write down very specific goals. Measurable, so you can actually track it and keep track of it and say, yep, I did it. Achievable, like don't bite off more than you can chew. Realistic, and time bound. So you would say, in 60 days, I want you to have this. And then finally, I want you to think about being strategic as opposed to reactionary. I sat down with an HR manager who I worked with in one of the projects that I was working on, and she was explaining some stuff about how she approaches problems. And I was really impressed. It wasn't here's a problem and here's some logical solutions. She really stepped way back and thought about, okay, what, as a whole system of this entire organization, what would happen if I moved this lever or turned this knob or flipped this switch? She was thinking very systemic about the whole environment, the whole system of the organization, and strategically about her ideas. A lot of times you'll see in meetings where people from HR come in and they're like, here's all the things we need to do because I read about this in an HR article, or I just got back from an HR conference. And then you have a developer come in and say, here's all the things that we need to do. And then you have someone from marketing and sales and operations, and all these different people are coming in with like kind of their pet projects, right? And they're saying, well, here's all the stuff and best practices that we have to do, but they're not thinking about strategically as a whole. And I'll tell you what, most of the time, executives and the real company leaders, they're looking very high from the strategic platform. So my invitation to you is, yes, figure out what the best practices are for your role. Figure out what the best practices are for your team, but think about at that high strategic level and that systemic level, okay, maybe these are best practices generally, but do they work in my industry? And do they work in this system? Would they work with our company culture, right? So you got to figure out all that stuff. My invitation is to start thinking systemically and thinking strategically as opposed to just figuring out a certain little cog in the wheel. All right, let's move over to networking and branding. Folks, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them into the Q&A box in Zoom. And actually, let me just address this one here from Anonymous. I agree with high speed, low drag. What do you do when a company is not even prepared for you to start? For example, no desk, no paperwork, which has a deadline from HR, no goals on your first day. And then the person you report into goes out of town for 3 days your first week. Ugh, that doesn't sound fun. I did not last long in that position, 5 days. The onboarding was pathetic. There was only so much I could do to be proactive. I'll flip that around just a little bit. I'll answer that in a second, but I'll throw another scenario. In a role that I was in, I had, I think, a 12 or a 15-page onboarding document, and it had everything lined out, and it was beautiful. I could tell that my manager spent a lot of time thinking about onboarding me into this position. And I got the document from him, and we never ever talked about it. He never referred to it. He never asked about any specific thing. There was a few times that I said, hey, by the way, in this onboarding document on page 3, you wanted me to do this by then. You know, where are we at on that? I've done my part. Like, where are you at on your? It's like, oh, wait, what was that? I don't even remember that. And I thought, okay, this is when I realized that the boss was really brilliant at creating these philosophical systems, but it was really good on paper, but then he moved on from it, right? And that's the whole spirit of what this whole session is and my course on onboarding is. I want you to figure out how you should onboard. You know, the interesting thing, Anonymous, and I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but one of my questions would be, is your boss still there? Because it sounds like he or she, I don't know if it's a he or she, sounds like he or she doesn't know what they were doing. They clearly were not prepared to have you come in. It was a mess. You felt like it was a mess. Maybe this was their pattern, right? So what happens when you're a sophisticated professional and you're going to come in and do things on purpose and your boss isn't, right? If your boss is flighty. Now, the interesting thing is if they hire you, you might adopt some of their brand. You might inherit some of their branding of being flighty and being disorganized and stuff like that. So what I would do is once I really do understand they don't have anything for me to do, probably one of the first things I would do, if I had the freedom to, and I think you do, is I would start interviewing people in the organization. I remember sitting down with the COO, who was instrumental in hiring me, and the CMO, who I didn't report to, but I was in her department, and then people on the team. I sat down in the first week or two in one-on-ones, and I had that question, what is success in this role? How do you see success? And those were the questions that I asked from people above me. And then people that were my peers and colleagues, my question was, how do we work together? Like, what do you understand my role is? And help me understand what your role is. And honestly, if you don't have anything else to do for that first week, that's probably how I would coach you to spend that first week. You don't need paperwork. You don't need a desk. You just need to go to a bunch of people and say, hey, can I get 20 or 30 minutes on your calendar? Want to introduce myself, understand how we're going to be working together and how we can best work together. This is the whole spirit of this, of what I'm talking about is instead of letting the boss or HR figure out how you should be onboarded, I want you to kind of take the bull by the horns and say, okay, to be effective in this role, I'm going to start having these meetings. I'm going to start talking with people. And that leads perfectly into networking and branding. Why? If I start having these meetings with the CMO and the COO and peers and colleagues, I'm developing my internal network and I'm creating the perception. I'm creating my own personal brand. I remember sitting down with somebody and asking those questions like, hey, help me understand what you do. And what do you understand my role is? Because in this role that I'm thinking about, it was brand new. The position, the department was brand new. It was this kind of skunkworks project. It was created just for a special project. And so the people that I sat down with are like, okay, this is what I do. And this is what, this is what I do all day. And these are my objectives and stuff like that. She's like, I don't understand what you're doing, because what I've heard is that you're completely overlapping what my role is. And I was astute enough to hear she was saying, are you taking my job? Like, I do this job. Why did they hire you? Right. And so that was really interesting for me to go into that environment and just listen and understand. The question is, how do we work well together? And her answer was, I don't know, because I'm doing the same thing that I think you're supposed to be doing. And that was an opportunity for me to kind of say, to educate, right? And say, okay, here's my understanding of what our whole program is and what my role is. And I think that was really important. All right. One of the books that I want you to read, and I recommended this, I think, when we talked about personal branding, is Brag. It's kind of hard to go into a new environment where you're the new person and you're trying to understand the culture and you're trying to figure out who the players are, and you're also trying to communicate what your value is that you bring to the table. And a lot of us, especially, I see this in different cultures to different degrees. There's certain cultures that are just way more reserved and more quiet about putting their value proposition in front of a person or a team. But I've seen this in a lot of cultures. A lot of people, when I talk about personal branding, people in Europe are like, yeah, we don't do all the stuff that Americans do. Americans are like in your face branding. But I'll tell you what, I've been in America for a long time. There are people in America who have a really hard time communicating what their value add is and creating that personal brand. So what I would like you to do, one of the first books I would like you to read when you land your new job is Brag, B-R-A-G, by Peggy Kloss. Read that book, because I think as you communicate with new people in your organization, it's going to give you permission and ideas and techniques so that you can really communicate effectively without feeling like you're going overboard and without other people feeling like you're going overboard. All right, with networking and branding, I want you to communicate. I want you to communicate effectively. I want you to communicate a lot, not spending too much time in meetings or with people when you shouldn't be, but I want you to have good and strong communication. That is a lot of what networking and branding is. Let me give you two tactics that I used in my last role that I thought were extremely effective for my brand and for networking. So one of them was I would write my boss a weekly update on what I had done that week, what I was working on, what I had accomplished, and what I was going to work on the next week. And some of these emails were about a page long. Okay, so it served multiple purposes. One purpose was documenting for myself what I was doing and the progress that I was making. And I could actually go look through those weekly update emails and see the progress that I was making. And I can go refer to something from 3 months ago, somebody that I talked with or something like that. Maybe there was a ball that I dropped, right? So it was actually a tool for myself. However, this was a really important tool for my boss because my boss and I met plenty. We had great communication, but I know that sometimes a boss will go into a meeting and they will say, they'll be asked, how's Jason doing, or what's Jason doing, or something like that, and he'll be like, yeah, I don't know. I really don't know what they're doing, and I'm not sure if they're doing anything. And I've been in meetings where this happens, and you're like, wait a minute, we all know that person has been really busy and productive. Why is the boss blanking on this right now? Well, I'm not one to play politics and stuff like that, but I am convinced that we need to communicate the value that we're bringing in. We can't assume that our boss knows what we're doing and the value that we're bringing and why what we're doing is so important, okay? Even if they give us the projects, even if we have one-on-ones and we talk about it, you know how it is. There's just a lot of things going on at work. And if they get cornered in the wrong time by the wrong person, they might draw a blank on you, okay? I've seen it happen. What I didn't realize was that my boss had these questions posed to him before about other people that had reported to him. And a lot of times he was like, I really don't know what that other person has been doing, which really is a problem with my boss, right? I mean, that's his fault and his problem, but it became my problem. It became other people's problems when he couldn't defend them. Not saying that this is always a yucky environment. This was actually a great environment, but we need to communicate what we're doing. These weekly updates were awesome. And usually what I would get back was a thank you. Hey, it wasn't long. It didn't respond to hardly any of the messaging that I had, but a lot of times it was, hey, I really appreciate that. Thank you. I guarantee, because I heard this from my boss's superiors, that the perception that people were getting of me in the organization was that I was a hustler. I was a hard worker. I got a lot of things done. I was always working on strategic things. I was doing the right things. This happened because I perhaps over communicated. This is a tool that I just kind of came up with in my last role. I don't know if I read about it or I just came up with it on my own. I've never done it in a role previous to this, but I thought it was really important for me to justify what I was doing that week. And it turned out to be an exceptionally useful tool to help my brand and help my boss understand that I was definitely bringing value. All right, the last thing on this topic is similar to that, but it's a little different. I encourage you to keep a journal. So this email that you're sharing with your boss, it really becomes a part of your journal and your journey and your documentation. But you might want to keep a private journal that your boss isn't going to see, but you can draw on later if you need to. The interesting thing about this private journal is you might name names, right? You might say, well, I had this meeting with this person and it didn't go well at all, and here's why. This is not necessarily something that you want, to get out. You don't want people knowing that you're talking about them or writing about them. I don't feel bad about this. This is stuff that you should be documenting, and this can help you when you have an annual review, right? So the way annual reviews happen is you sit down and they're like, okay, well, here's all the stuff you did last year, and they're really heavy on the last couple of months. Well, you might want to pull something from your journal from 10 or 11 months ago and say, hey, don't forget that we did this. This was a major initiative and it was a major win. And this needs to be considered as you're talking about the future of me in this organization. So those are some of the tools and techniques that I would recommend. Norman says, don't forget to mention the importance of developing relationships with people in other departments. Having a good rapport with your boss is good, but not enough to make it more likely you will have longevity with an organization. Absolutely. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier on. One of the 30, 60, 90 goals might be that you say, I want to meet one or two people from each of these organizations. I want to impress upon you as we think about networking, we're not having one meeting with somebody and then we've networked with them and now we have a relationship. Figure out how you can have multiple touch points with them, okay? So when Norman says developing relationships with people from other departments, you don't develop a relationship from one meeting or one email, right? You need to figure out how to have regular meetings with these people. And it could mean that when you understand what their department is doing and you understand what their role is, now you can actually bring, when you're in your own team meeting, you can say, hey, by the way, this other department is doing some of this stuff. We should talk with them and collaborate with them, or we should get their input because of what they're working on, right? So yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really important. All right, Daniel says, going by the recent pandemic, a lot of the companies in my part of the world, in Africa, are shifting to remote-based model. How can some of the things you speak about be applied in a remote work environment where I'm not seeing who the decision makers are, or how can strike the balance between not being too aggressive and not being too laid back? So really a lot of the stuff that we're talking about can be done remotely on emails, right? So if you're in a group email and there's this thread that people are replying to, you're gonna get a sense, right? This is where your emotional intelligence, your awareness of others has to kind of peak, and you have to listen to what people are saying or not saying, right? So somebody might weigh in on something with a lot of good ideas and just kind of tuck that away. This person has great ideas. Somebody else might downvote everything, right? And so this is somebody who kind of feels like a wet blanket, but they might actually have a lot of influence in that, hey, we just have to convince that one person and then we can move forward. Well, if you realize who that one person is and that they're influential in that way, then that will help you know, when I want to propose something or when I want to champion something, I need to go to that person perhaps in private, offline, before the email thread starts, and I need to sell the concept to them. I need to get them as an ally so that when the email thread starts, they are not the wet blanket that kind of squashes everything, okay? So I think that, whether it's in Slack or Teams or an email or on Zoom calls, just increase your awareness of others. In my emotional intelligence course, I talk about the 5 pillars of emotional intelligence. And the third one is the fourth one is sometimes called empathy, but a lot of people will switch empathy with awareness of others. You need to figure out, Daniel, who people are. And a lot of that is listening and paying attention and watching how these decisions are made and who's influencing, who has the smart ideas, who are the people who have great ideas but never follow through, who are the people who don't, they don't really bring a lot of ideas to the table, but they're excellent at operations and getting things done, right? So I think to answer your question, Daniel, is that it can absolutely be done remotely. We just need to increase our awareness of others. All right, let's go to the last topic of this session, which is career management. Once again, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them into the question and answer section. So like I said, career management is normally, when I talk about career management, it's made up of 2 or 3 things. Networking, which we've talked about. You got to make sure you do your internal networking. Branding, so how do other people perceive you? And then my newest topic in career management is income streams, multiple streams of revenue, and creating what I call income security. I'll tell you, if there's a blog post that I have where I talk about getting laid off for my last job when they killed the project. So kind of a long story of how it happened, but the executives decided to pull the plug on the project, and then everybody in that team, including myself, got let go. And I remember sitting across the table from my boss, who was, kind of apologetic and, we're really sorry. But here's when your last day is, right? And if you've ever had to lay anybody off, it's not fun. It's very stressful and has this emotional burden on you. Of course, it's a heavier burden on the other person. But I was getting laid off from this job, and it was a really nice job. It was well-paying. I loved the team. I loved the project. I loved the future. And I was sad to lose all of that. But here I am. Let's see. This was 14 years. No, this is about 12 years after my big layoff in 2006. So in 2006, I get laid off. And when I got laid off, they took away 100% of my income. Because I only had one income stream. It was my job. And when they took that away, they took away 100% of my income and my ability to pay my bills. Well, here I am 12 years later, and I get let go. And I'm thinking, okay, this is a great job, and I really wish I could have made this project happen, and I wish I would have had more time. But you're taking away less than 50% of my income. I had built revenue streams to the point where losing my job didn't hurt as much as it did in 2006. And by no means am I saying that to brag about how cool I am or how smart I am. But what I'm saying is I want you to seriously think, as a part of your career management, what can you do to create revenue streams or income streams so that if you lose your job, which for most of us is our primary income stream, that it doesn't completely hurt you. Okay, so anyways, those are the 3 parts of career management. In addition to those parts of career management, here are a few other thoughts that I had. The stuff that we've talked about with networking and branding and, meeting these people and learning, right? Becoming a constant learner, all this stuff. I want you to think that you're going to be out of that job in the next maybe couple of years. I had somebody who came into JibberJobber. JibberJobber is a CRM for job seekers. So she came into JibberJobber and she used JibberJobber, and then she landed her dream job. And she emailed me and she said, "Hey, Jason, I just landed my dream job. I'm so happy. I'm going to be there until I retire. And so could you please go delete my JibberJobber account? I just don't want that CRM stuff hanging out there in the internet." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely, no problem. Are you sure?" Because what we do basically is we just store it, and we have all the security that we can think of to put into place so nobody can access your stuff. But if you ever need to look for a job again, then you can start where you left off from. And she said, "No, man, this is my dream job, and I'll be here until I retire." And so I asked her again, and ultimately we deleted her account, which is fine. And it was great. That was her choice. 2 months later, she came back. 2 months. And she said, "Didn't work out. Can I get all my stuff back?" And I was like, "Yeah, sorry. I mean, we deleted it. You asked us to do a hard delete on your data." But that, for me, that was a huge lesson. Your dream job a few years ago might have been at Enron. What an amazing company, right? Like on the stock market, they were performing. In the industry, they were performing. They were just an awesome, huge, amazing company. And you could bank your retirement on them. You could invest in them, and you had their pension and all these wonderful things. And then a couple of people made some horrible decisions that impacted tens and tens of thousands of people. I got messages from people who were 64 and a half, right? They were going to retire from this amazing career at an amazing company. They were going to retire in a few months. And overnight, they saw their pension disappear. They saw their 401k disappear. Folks, I need you, I beg you to think about your career. Love your company. Work at your company. Give everything you can to your company, but don't let them own the rest of your future, because you never know how long they're going to last and what they're going to do and what changes might come down the road. So I want you to do these career management things, and the phrase is wash, rinse, repeat. Do these things over and over. You don't stop networking when you get your job. You don't stop thinking about your brand and working on your brand when you get your job. Celebrate, yes. Relax a little, yes. But continue working on networking and branding. Make this a part of the rest of your career. Make this a part of your DNA. Giving, all the stuff that we've been talking about, learning. The last thing, just real quick, is to figure out your money. I think that it's so important that we understand budgets, that we understand how we earn money, that we understand how we spend money. We need to understand, one of the phrases that I learned from venture capitalists that I completely brought into job seekers is, what's your runway? Right? So venture capitalists will say, what's your runway? How much time before you run out of money, assuming that you don't get any more money in on sales or whatever. Well, for job seekers, we need to understand, how much time do I have before I have to go get any job to pay some bills, right? But if you're employed, you need to understand how much time you have if you lose your job or your income right now. Dave Ramsey talks about having your emergency fund. That's baby step number 1 out of 7. It's having $1,000 in the bank to cover these emergencies. But then he talks about creating, it's not emergency fund. That's your $1,000. There's another fund, I don't remember what it's called, but it's your 3 to 6 months of income. How do I create this buffer so that if I do lose my job, I have money in the bank that I can pay bills for the next few months? Okay, so I want you to figure out your money. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. With that, let me switch over to the Q&A section. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and throw them into the Q&A. Norman says the only real security is to develop your own business. And even that is subject to having a service or product that others will continue to want as times change. Yeah, I agree with that. I think I'm going to take that one step further and say, if there is such a thing as having real income security, it's not just having your own business. I'm going to say it's having multiple streams of income. Over the last 14 years, since my big layoff in 2006, I've developed different streams of income. And those different streams of income have kind of like a mutual fund. With the diversity, it mitigates risk, right? So instead of having one business or one job, because I've had various business lines as I've run Jibber Jobber. I was a professional speaker where I got paid $5,000 a pop to go on stage for an hour, which, I don't know, that could sound like a lot of money or it could sound like not much money. But $5,000 for a 1-hour presentation was a pretty sweet deal for me. Well, that happened because I wrote a book on LinkedIn, and nobody else had written a book for regular people on LinkedIn. I was the first one, really. And so when all these conferences were happening and they wanted someone to speak about LinkedIn, they'd find my book on Amazon, call me up, say, hey, we need you to come speak at our event. And I'd tell them what my fee was. And a lot of times they'd say yes. And it was awesome for about 1.5 years. And then after 1.5 years, there was about 400 people who had written a book on LinkedIn, right? Like everybody and their dog became an expert on LinkedIn. And all of a sudden, people don't want to pay me what my fee was. So if that was my business, professional speaking, there was a window of opportunity. There was a time where I sold DVDs on how to use LinkedIn, and that went really well. There was a time when I did this thing or when I did that thing, but I've had to adapt and change my strategy based on what was happening in the market. One of the things that I found is how awesome and powerful it is to have these little lines of income streams or business lines, but add other ones to diversify and mitigate the risk. Okay, Norm says, I've joined some organizations that were perfect when they started, but people in management changed, or there was an acquisition or merger and everything changed. Unfortunately, it's just the reality that any job can change at any time. Remember I told you that it was my dream job with my dream boss? Well, guess what? My boss left. He went to go do his own entrepreneurial thing, and everything changed. So the company was still awesome. The market didn't change. Everything about the opportunity was the same, but the boss changed, and that changed everything. Norm says that really is the challenge, being able to adapt your strategy when old solutions no longer work. I'll tell you a funny story about that. I think it was back in 1997. I went out to Washington, D.C., where I went to high school. I was on a business trip, and I went to hang out with my old friend from high school. And, we're talking about, we've become adults by now, and we're talking about like careers and stuff. And my plan then was to major in Spanish, because Spanish never changes. So you can learn it, and then you don't have to learn it for the rest of your life. And then go work in business or something like that. And my friend was like, dude, you got to get into IT programming. It's so fun. It's so awesome. You get to learn stuff every day. And I was like, man, that sounds miserable, to like learn stuff every day. Sounds horrible. Well, long story short, I changed my major from international business and Spanish, and I went into IT. And it has been, it's kind of frustrating having, mastering something to a certain degree, and then like 6 months later, you have to move on and learn something else. I don't consider myself super duper passionate about learning new stuff all the time for the rest of my life until I die. But what I did learn was that I love this environment where we can be continual learners. Not that we're getting outdated all the time, but there's always interesting, fun stuff. These changes are inevitable, right? So the question as we manage our own career is, how do we make sure that we're not stuck in a rut and stuck doing one thing, and that we're able to move around depending on situations or opportunities or market changes or whatever. Folks, I don't see any more questions in the queue, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for coming out today. Tomorrow, same time, same place at noon Mountain Time. I don't know where you are in the world, but it's noon Mountain Time. We're going to talk about personal finances as a job seeker, and once you land your first job. I'm very passionate about this, and I think it'll be a fun conversation. So with that, thank you, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.